What if his silence says more about him than it ever did about you? And what if the ache you feel now is not about this man, but about a voice you've carried within for years, whispering that you were never quite enough? Let's begin here. In that suspended moment after the calls stop, the messages don't come and the attention you once held suddenly vanishes. It feels personal. It feels like failure. And inside the echo of that absence, something ancient wakes up. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being ignored, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being unseen while still emotionally attached. He didn't say goodbye, he just vanished. And now your mind replays every word, every glance, every silence, trying to understand where it all went wrong. But what if I told you it didn't begin with him? That his withdrawal only touched an old bruise that was already there? When you grew up equating love with attention and attention with safety, then the absence of it, even from someone unreliable, feels like rejection at your very core. And that pain doesn't come from today. It's the resurrection of all the moments when you felt unworthy of being chosen, protected, prioritized. You begin to internalize, maybe I said too much. Maybe I wanted too much. Maybe I was too emotional, too intense, too demanding. And without realizing it, you place the blame on yourself. Not because it's true, but because it's what you've always done to survive emotional unpredictability. Freud once said that unprocessed wounds repeat themselves, not because we enjoy suffering, but because we unconsciously seek resolution. The man who disappears without explanation becomes a symbol of a deeper dynamic, one where your worth feels conditional, where silence is interpreted as proof of failure. But silence is not evidence, it is absence, and absence should never be a mirror for self-worth. Let me tell you about Clara, a woman of 56, long divorced, strong, self-reliant, but still startled by the silence of a man who once seemed so attentive. They met at a mutual friend's gathering. He was charming, present, curious. For a few weeks he texted every morning, checked in during the day, ended calls with tenderness. Clara, who had spent years building walls, began, cautiously, to hope. Then, just as suddenly, he went quiet. Days turned into weeks. Her thoughts spiraled. Was it something she said? Did she lean in too soon? Should she have played harder to get? The more he withdrew, the more she doubted herself. Her dignity wrestled with her longing. But what Freud would ask is, why does this feel so familiar? Because for Clara, this wasn't just about him. It was about her father, who would disappear for days during her childhood. It was about years of performing perfection to earn approval, to be deemed worthy of staying. His silence wasn't the wound, it was the trigger. And here lies the illusion. We think the pain is about now, when it's really about then. The current man is just the surface. Beneath him lives a history of unhealed narratives, and unless we question them, we will continue to confuse someone else's emotional absence with our personal inadequacy. So, I ask you, are you trying to fix the past through the present? Are you seeking redemption from people who were never capable of witnessing you? When he stopped calling, it hurt, not just because he left, but because a part of you still believes that being loved means being chosen consistently. And when that doesn't happen, the inner child in you assumes she's the problem. But here's the truth. Your worth doesn't fluctuate with someone's inconsistency. You are not too much. You are not unlovable. You are simply no longer willing to beg for crumbs and call it connection. Here is your symbolic task for today. Write yourself a message that begins with, I no longer chase silence. Finish the sentence. Speak it aloud. Let your nervous system hear it. Let your heart believe it. Because healing begins when you stop personalizing someone else's limitations. And perhaps, just perhaps, the silence you're hearing now is not rejection, it's release. The unconscious patterns that dictate our choices. Have you ever found yourself whispering, why do I always end up here? Same heartbreak, different face, same pull, same pain. And though the names change, the ending feels eerily familiar. This is not a coincidence, it's a pattern. And behind every pattern is a hidden script, often written in childhood, rehearsed through adolescence and performed in adulthood until we become aware enough to rewrite it. Psychology calls it repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to reenact old emotional wounds in the hope of mastering them. Not because we want to suffer, but because we want to win this time. We want the unavailable to finally choose us. We want to heal the mother wound by fixing our partners. We want the chaos to become calm. And we keep choosing familiar pain because it feels like home. Freud saw this in his patients, the magnetic pull toward relationships that replicated early trauma. Jung observed it in the dance between archetypes, the wounded child, the neglected lover, the over-functioning nurturer. These patterns don't scream, they whisper, and we obey, believing we are choosing freely when in fact we are following a pre-written script. Think of Elena, a 47-year-old woman who kept falling for emotionally distant men. At first they seemed independent, successful, mysterious. She felt intrigued, alive. But soon, she was always the one initiating contact, over-explaining her needs, justifying her emotions. They would withdraw and she would chase. To anyone else it was obvious. These men were not emotionally available, but for Elena, it felt like destiny. Each time she believed this would be the one who finally stayed, who finally chose her, consistently, fully. But each time she ended up emotionally exhausted, questioning her worth. In therapy, we uncovered the root. Elena's mother was cold, critical, emotionally aloof. As a child, Elena learned to perform for affection, to be good, helpful, undemanding. Love for her was not a given, it was something to earn. So now, as an adult, she doesn't feel drawn to warmth, she feels drawn to withdrawal. Because if she can finally make the distant man stay, she will have rewritten the ending of her original story. But she cannot. Not through others. She must do it within herself. Attachment theory deepens this lens. If you grew up with inconsistency, you might have developed an anxious attachment style, craving closeness, fearing abandonment, tolerating too much. Or perhaps you shut down altogether, adopting an avoidant style, appearing independent, but inwardly terrified of true intimacy. Either way, your nervous system reacts not to the present, but to the echo of the past. So I ask you, are you in love with him, or with the fantasy of finally being enough for someone who keeps slipping away? Freud would remind us, we are not determined by our past, but we are shaped by it, until we become conscious. The moment you see the pattern is the moment you interrupt it. Awareness is not just healing, it's liberation. You are not cursed in love. You are not doomed to repeat the same pain, but you must stop expecting your wounds to be healed by those who resemble the ones who created them. Here is your symbolic task. Journal this sentence. The first time I felt emotionally unsafe was when... Let it take you back. Let your body speak. Because once you name the origin, the pattern begins to lose power. And remember, the woman you are becoming does not confuse intensity with intimacy, nor silence with strength. She chooses differently. She loves consciously. And above all, and she no longer chooses what hurts just because it feels familiar. The power dynamics of silent treatment. What if the silence wasn't just a disappearance, but a message, not spoken in words, but in the calculated withdrawal of them? What if the absence wasn't accidental, but strategic? Silent treatment is not just about emotional distance, it's about control. It's the kind of manipulation that doesn't raise its voice, but still shakes your nervous system. And often it works because you've been trained, long before him, to internalize silence as a sign that you did something wrong. Let's be clear. Silence, when used with intention to punish, confuse, or provoke fear, is not maturity. It's not boundaries. It's behavioral manipulation. And it's one of the most subtle yet effective tools in power dynamics, because it makes you doubt yourself before you ever question the other. Imagine a child whose parent gives them the cold shoulder after an emotional outburst. The child learns quickly. Affection is conditional, connection can be revoked, and silence becomes a form of emotional exile, a psychological timeout. That same child, now grown, will often panic when faced with withdrawal. She will explain, apologize, overcompensate, anything to restore connection. This is how emotional dependency begins. I want to introduce you to Soraya. She's 61, widowed young, fiercely independent, but still carrying emotional scars from a late relationship where every disagreement was met with silence, days without contact, a cold wall instead of conversation. And each time she reached out to resolve things, she felt smaller, more ashamed, more desperate. Soraya wasn't needy. She was conditioned. conditioned to believe that harmony must be earned, that love is fragile, that her voice is a threat. But Freud would say, where the voice is silenced, the self begins to disappear. When silence becomes a weapon, it rewires your behavior. You start walking on eggshells, afraid to upset. You trade authenticity for approval. You overfunction to prevent being ignored. And the tragedy is this: your emotional life becomes a performance for someone who may not even be present. This is not love. This is reinforcement in its most toxic form. In behaviorist terms, intermittent reinforcement, when affection and attention are given inconsistently, is one of the strongest conditioners of attachment. The unpredictable silence followed by sudden warmth creates a cycle of emotional addiction. Like a gambler waiting for the next win, you stay. Not because it's fulfilling, but because you hope it will be again. But let me tell you something. The woman who reclaims her voice refuses to beg for breadcrumbs. She stops explaining herself to silence. She understands that respect is not negotiated. It's either present or it's not. So I ask you, what are you trying to prove by staying silent in return? And more importantly, why do you need his engagement to validate your experience? Here is your symbolic task. For the next 24 hours, resist the urge to reach out to anyone who has consistently ignored your boundaries, not to punish but to practice self-respect. Write instead, I no longer explain my worth to silence. Because the real power doesn't lie in who stays quiet the longest. It lies in who no longer fears what silence used to mean. The myth of not being enough. How many times have you stood in front of a mirror and asked yourself, what's wrong with me? Not because you didn't know your strengths, but because someone else's absence made you doubt them. How many times have you mistaken silence for a verdict and emotional neglect for a reflection of your own value? This is the myth that you were left, ignored, or unloved because you weren't enough. Not pretty enough, not soft enough, not quiet enough, or maybe not light enough, not small enough, not willing enough to disappear when he needed space. But this myth was not born in adulthood. It was planted early, in the gaze that didn't soften when you cried, in the voices that made your feelings feel excessive, in the subtle ways the world taught you to earn your place. And over time, it crystallized into a belief. I must be the reason they go. Internalized inadequacy is a slow poison. It teaches you to scan yourself for flaws every time someone pulls away. It teaches you to shrink, emotionally, physically, even spiritually, in the hopes of becoming palatable. It convinces you that if you were just a little less or a little more, then maybe love would stay. Freud might say, the ego builds its shape not only from what it is, but from what it believes it must become to be accepted. Consider Marcia, a 63-year-old woman who spent decades in a marriage where her presence was barely acknowledged unless she was serving, solving, or smoothing conflict. When it ended, she carried the residue of that role into every new encounter. She'd show up with grace, intelligence, depth, and still feel unseen, because in her psyche, being seen had always required self-erasure. So when a man didn't call back, she didn't just feel disappointed. She felt defective. The pain was disproportionate because it tapped into something far older than the present. It touched the young girl in her who was taught to earn visibility, who equated being chosen with being enough. But let's ask the uncomfortable question. What if you're not too much? What if you're just too awake for those still emotionally asleep? Too often, women learn to doubt their own fullness, to believe that being expressive, intuitive, passionate, or intense is a liability, as if desire must be dulled to be worthy, as if truth must be muted to be lovable. But you were never meant to be less. You were meant to be met. Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we hide, repress, or deny. For many women, this includes their power, their anger, their refusal to perform. And every time you apologize for your depth, you feed the shadow. Every time you tolerate disrespect in the name of understanding, you betray your own boundaries. Let me offer you a different mirror, one not distorted by abandonment but polished by truth. You are not unchosen because you are lacking. You are unchosen because you no longer fit the mold of a woman who disappears to be loved. And yes, that's lonely. Yes, that's hard. But it's also sacred, because when you stop shrinking, you start attracting only those who can hold space for your fullness. No more translating your silence into worthlessness. No more chasing approval from those committed to misunderstanding you. Here is your symbolic task. Write the sentence, "I'm not too much. I'm no longer pretending to be small." Place it where you can see it. Read it when doubt creeps in. Let your nervous system rewire through repetition. You were never the problem. You were simply never meant to be understood by people who only feel safe when you stay silent, transforming pain into personal growth. What if your heartbreak wasn't just an ending, but an invitation, not to chase someone else's love, but to finally witness your own? What if the silence he left behind was the space you needed to hear yourself again? Pain, when it first arrives, feels like collapse, like the ground beneath you has shifted, and the self you thought you were is suddenly unrecognizable. The impulse is to resist it, to fix, to numb, to distract. But transformation never happens in avoidance. It happens in the quiet aftermath, when you stop asking why he left and start asking why you stayed so long without being met. To move from victim to witness is not to deny the hurt. It is to reclaim the narrative. Not, "He broke me," but "I now see what I accepted and why." Pain seen clearly becomes clarity, and clarity, when honored, becomes power. Take Helena, 58, who told me she had always been strong, raised children alone, built a career, endured betrayal with dignity. But when her last relationship ended, abruptly, without closure, she found herself unraveling in a way that frightened her. "I thought I had done all the work," she said, "but I couldn't stop crying. I felt humiliated." What Freud might say is this: emotional regression is not failure, it is data. Helena's grief wasn't only about this man, it was about years of emotional labor, unacknowledged needs, swallowed disappointments. The loss cracked something open, not her strength but her self-protection, and inside that crack was the truth. She had been surviving, not living. So instead of rushing to heal, Helena paused. She wrote letters she never sent. She screamed into pillows. She walked in silence. She stopped asking what made her unworthy and started noticing where she had betrayed herself to keep peace. That shift, from blaming him to witnessing herself, was the beginning of her return. This is the sacred role of reflection. It does not erase the past, but it translates pain into wisdom. It allows you to ask without judgment, where did I abandon myself? When did I start believing that being loved meant enduring discomfort? What did I silence in order to be accepted? Every wound, when traced back, reveals a lesson not just about others, but about your own patterns. And when you begin to see them, not with shame, but with compassion, you no longer live as a prisoner to them. This is not self-help. This is self-reclamation. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You don't heal by pretending you're fine. You heal by sitting with your unmet needs, by witnessing your own longing, by allowing yourself to grieve the version of you who tolerated less than she deserved. And then, slowly, you begin to build differently. You stop making excuses for emotional inconsistency. You speak even when your voice trembles. You prioritize connection over attention. You ask not, "Do they like me?" but "Do I feel safe here?" Here is your symbolic task. Light a candle tonight, not for him, but for yourself. Whisper the words, "I return to myself." Let it be a ritual. Let it be enough. Because the woman who rises from heartbreak is not the same woman who fell in love. She is wiser, clearer, fiercely tender with herself, and she no longer disappears in love. She is visible, first to herself, then to the world. Your pain was never the ending. It was the portal. And now you walk through it. If you've made it this far, it means you're not afraid to look inward, to ask the harder questions, to face not only the pain others have caused, but the ways you may have silenced yourself to feel worthy of love. And that is emotional courage. You see, it was never about whether he called, or stayed, or explained. It was always about what his silence awakened in you. The old wounds, the buried beliefs, the forgotten self. But today you've done more than listen. You've remembered that your voice matters, that your patterns can be understood and undone, that solitude isn't punishment, it's a portal. The woman you're becoming doesn't ask for crumbs. She sets the table for herself. So I'll leave you with this. A woman who walks alone is not always lonely. Sometimes she's complete. If this journey stirred something in you, a realization, a memory, a quiet yes. I invite you to share it. Leave a comment. What belief about yourself are you ready to let go of? Or simply write, I return to myself. And if you want more conversations like this, ones that honor your depth, your mind, your evolution, subscribe. Join us. This is not just a channel, it's a mirror. And you finally are learning to see yourself clearly.